Nate Diaz went from fighting 5 times in 1 year to only fighting 5 times in the last 6 years of his UFC run, and became so frustrated to get a fight booked that he took a leak on the UFC headquarters. Nate Diaz is one of the biggest superstars in the UFC, but only had 3 main events in his entire time fighting. And while battling with Dana White in the UFC more than any other fighter of this generation besides Ngannou, as his star grew bigger, the less fights he started taking. Nate Diaz blew up after fighting Conor McGregor, but then took a 3-year hiatus and got blatantly disrespected by the UFC, and his skills only started getting worse and worse till he eventually fell victim to Jake Paul. The prime of a UFC fighter is from 27 to 33, and he fought Conor McGregor at the age of 30, and his next fight would be at the age of 33 against Anthony Pettis. Nate Diaz at his best was a top 5 ranked lightweight with all the potential of the world to becoming a champion, just like his brother did in Strikeforce. But what happened and where did it all go wrong? Well, after researching into this era of time, it's pretty clear that Nate Diaz isn't the only problem and reason why he didn't fight, and the UFC and Dana White have a lot to blame too. Dana White is obviously a huge figure and controversial as well, and he's been known for holding back fighters before, and a lot of time Dana White will pick and choose when money and rankings matter when it comes to booking a fight. If a fighter wants more money, then rankings are all of a sudden the end-all be-all. If a fighter is not going to pull in any money and doesn't care and just wants to fight for the belt, he's probably going to choose a bigger star, i.e. Merab getting the title shot over Cheeto. But Dana White has disputed with GSP, with Khabib, with Ngannou, with Conor. His track record of battling with his fighters is huge, the biggest one being Tito Ortiz, but having made a whole video on what happened with Conor in the UFC, but Conor did it a lot more to himself than Nate did. And a big problem is that Dana White and Nate Diaz have a long history. Dana and Nate's brother Nick didn't exactly see eye to eye all the time too. As you know, a Diaz brother is hard to work with in general, but he even went as far to say that Nate didn't move the needle, Nate shouldn't get the money, Nate isn't a star like his brother. This is well before the UFC blew up. And from that era, Nate and him had problems going back and forth all the time, and that's when you saw Nate going from fighting 3 to 4 to 5 times a year to fighting once a year, and this went for a long run of time. This whole needle mover mentality was a huge line and a huge line of dispute, and it really became the symbol of their feud. And of course, Nate Diaz gets that finish over Michael Johnson, calling out Conor, leading to Dos Anjos pulling out, leading to Conor versus Nate, and it was a massive fight where you could undoubtedly say that Nate was moving the needle. But what happened after the Conor fights? How did Nate end up becoming a massive star, probably the second biggest star in the UFC at that point in 2016, to all of a sudden not fighting? What comes with becoming a needle mover? You need more money. And how does the UFC contract work? You're locked into a guaranteed amount for a certain amount of fights, and that amount did not really account for Nate's newfound talent. Nate was likely getting pay-per-view points on the Conor Nate cards, I would imagine, and with that, his bigger star required more money, except not every fighter is Conor McGregor, and Nate Diaz isn't exactly a championship level fighter. So you're paying a pretty high premium that's probably either going to be the featured bout or the co-main event, and you're still going to have to pay your main event or your co-main event and the rest of the card. So there's a long run of time where Nate just simply was not being able to get a fight booked. Now, a good part of that could be Nate's fault with his newfound money. That is a theory, and the Diaz brothers are a little bit weird. They're not in a rush to get in a fight in the octagon because they'll get in a fight in the streets. And if you're enjoying this video so far, let me know what you want to see next, and leave a like, subscribe, and let's get back to it. What ended up happening in 2018 was Nate and Dustin got booked. Kinda. Nate and Dustin got booked. They had a full face-off, but then Nate said that they weren't giving him the money he wanted, and he never was actually signed to fight, and him and Dana went back and forth. Whose fault was it? Is it Nate's fault? Is it agreed? Is it happening? Is it not? And Dustin Poirier said in that mix-up that it was just so much time, and he was training and nursing an injury for this fight, that he eventually just cut ties and said, alright, whatever. If this isn't happening, if Nate isn't signed, I'm just gonna get surgery. And that's exactly what happened. They canceled the fight entirely, and that ended one of the most hyped fights ever. And to this day, people still want to see Nate versus Dustin, because just think about the boxing match, the jiu-jitsu. It's a really high-level fun fight. Now I think everyone knows Dustin would probably beat him, but at that time, that had a massive amount of hype, and for that fight to fall through, what were they offering Nate that Nate wasn't happy with the money? Is that even true? Is it Nate's fault or is it Dana's fault? So that back and forth was a huge dispute and a huge reason why Nate didn't fight from the years of 2016 to 2019. But After eventually settling that, in 2019, he hit a stride with the Anthony Pettis fight, getting a big finish against a good fighter. Yes, Anthony Pettis was sort of on a decline, but Anthony Pettis is a really legit fighter. So for Nate to beat him, that was huge. And then he got that massive BMF fight against Jorge Masvidal, which was also a main event. That fight ending in a doctor stoppage was of course disappointing. And then of course the pandemic happened, which led to Nate not fighting for a while. But then Nate versus Leon, where Nate's star grew even bigger and probably got the best picture in UFC history while getting his ass beat for 24 minutes. But anyways, it's Nate Diaz. At this point, we don't care, but at this point, he's also in his late 30s. We all know that Nate isn't going to fight for the belt, but that doesn't really matter. We just want to see him fight. So you might be saying, okay, they hit this stride in 2019 to 2021. Yes, he only fought 3 times within those 3 years, but hey, it's better than him not fighting at all. But what happened? Between 2021 and late 2022, Nate and the UFC went at it like never before. Interviews on interviews. Nate saying the UFC doesn't want to get him a fight. Nate calling out Dustin. Nate calling out literally everyone. Nate calling out Tony. Nate calling out Conor. Everyone was like, why is Nate not getting booked? There were so many hype fights for him. But then Dana White said Nate doesn't want to fight. Nate doesn't want to do this. But the real reason Nate was trying to get a fight booked was because he only had 1 fight left on his contract, and he was trying to go and box after, whether it be boxing a well-known boxer, but he was aiming for the Jake Paul fight. And then Dana White came out with the controversial statement that Nate Diaz should be looking at fighting Jake Paul because that's the kind of fights he's good for now. And that was huge. The level of disrespect to send to one of your biggest stars there is crazy. And just wait, because it doesn't even make sense considering what Dana White does after this. But this whole back and forth led to some point where Nate went up to the PI, asked to fight Francis Ngannou because Nate is Nate, and then took a piss on the UFC PI, which is also sort of their headquarters. That level of disrespect was crazy, but I think what's even crazier is Dana White just took it. You didn't really hear anything too crazy backlash, like why did he do that or what the hell is going on. Dana White didn't say anything about that, but instead what Dana White did was book him against Khamzat. So if you're thinking about this, Dana White said that Nate is only good for fighting Jake Paul now. He's not of the skill level anymore. Khamzat was a up and rising welterweight contender, and Nate didn't even need to fight Khamzat. Khamzat was next in line for the belt. There was just a holdup, and that's why Nate versus Khamzat happened. It was just a weird in-between fight, and that's just an insane statement to make. If you're gonna book Khamzat versus Nate, you're essentially feeding Nate to a monster in Khamzat. And of course the fight didn't end up happening because Khamzat missed weight and Nate versus Tony happened, which made a lot more sense, and Nate got his revenge and got the W. But why are you gonna book Nate versus Khamzat in that situation? That wasn't even a hype fight. Everyone was like, you're gonna send Nate off and getting beat up. You're clearly just trying to diminish his star. After Nate's contract ended, he of course went on to fight Jake Paul at the age of 38, got knocked down and got beat up pretty bad. Had some hype moments in the end though. But even now, Nate is still loyal to the UFC, which is really interesting because Nate and Jake were supposed to have a rematch in MMA in the PFL, and Nate was like, nah, I'm not fighting for the PFL. I'm a UFC guy, and Nate has even alluded to coming back to the UFC to fighting Conor. They're both later in their career, so it makes sense. But Nate really should have had a lot more fights, especially in his prime, because I think a lot of people now solely look at Nate as a fun fighter. When you think about his era, when you think about the RDAs, the Eddie Alvarez's, you can see Nate Diaz winning those fights. He was a fighter of that caliber. It was really shocking looking back and seeing just how good Nate was in his prime, and the fact that in his prime he was only fighting 1 fight a year, which is insane when he used to fight 5 to 4 times a year consistently early in his career, and he's been in the UFC since Tough Season 5, which is crazy. That was his first initial blow up, was when he got on Tough, and that's how he got his name out there, to even have a feud with Dana White about needing more money and not being a needle mover. So do you think this is more Nate's fault, or do you think this is the UFC's fault? And if you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out this one on the full story of Sean O'Malley in less than 5 minutes? And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, and don't forget, we're just getting started. We're gonna stay consistent, and I'll see you in the next video.